And the northern outer wall, there was houses that were built up against it. Now, these houses that we're talking about here was between the retaining wall on the inside and the outer wall on the outside, and they were actually up against the wall. Now, if you'll remember, that's consistent with what we were talking about with the spies. When Rahab, let the spies out through the window down the wall, that's very consistent with with what the Bible said. And of course, these walls also protected the town's water supply, which was actually a very important thing in that day and time, having a good water supply. And there's indication that there were some canals or aqueducts that actually distributed the water through the town. It's also interesting to note that it was the lowest city in the world, and it lay about 800 feet below sea level. So that's kind of an interesting thing there. And from that period of time to today, there's about 23 layers of settlement that's been unearthed by the archaeologists, that gives the current height of Jericho. So this city has been torn down and rebuilt and built up over the years, 23 layers. That's pretty thick, and that speaks to the age of the buildings.
Matter of fact, most of the archaeologists think that the Jericho that Joshua and the children of Israel are going to capture was probably about the 6th or 7th version of it, and they think that there had been habitation in the city for
long time before Joshua came along.
And a lot of them think this was really the first Canaanite city,
because
a lot of hunter-gatherers, people like that, they kind of roam. They established the city there.
Right.
But then they kept building it and rebuilding it.
And they kept rebuilding it on the foundation of the older structures. And that kind of tells you why the thing kept building up. Now, it's estimated using formulas and stuff that the population of Jericho was somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 people and that's so many people per square foot. Now, the time frame that we're looking at is about 1400 BC, and this was the time when, of course, the Israelites were going to attack the city. And this time frame is important, especially when you're reading about the archaeology of the city, because there was some dispute in different times about, did this happen or did it not happen? And the time frame of the 1400 BC is significant. So despite Joshua's long military experience, he had never really attacked a fortified city before. This was a new endeavor for the children of Israel. And if you read back the history and the military tactics that have to be used to attack a fortified city, the children of Israel didn't have these things. So we kind of don't think about that, but this was going to be a very daunting task, without God's help in this deal. And there was probably no way, because the battles that the children of Israel had fought up to that time were pretty much out in the open, using the classical phalanx type of military maneuver. And if Joshua being the commander, he'd have to be in the back of his mind, how am I going to do this? How is God going to lead me, through this? And in fact, all the walled cities in Palestine, Jericho was probably the most invincible. It was the strongest one out there. And, that was going to, come back to the question of armaments that the children of Israel had. They didn't have siege engines. They didn't have battering rams. They didn't have catapults or moving towers. Those were the things that traditionally would be used to attack a city of that type. Now, it wasn't unusual, though, even back in that time, for to do a siege. And that's kind of what, the king of Jericho was probably thinking about, that's what the children of Israel were going to do. And there's archaeologists have confirmed that this was probably going on because of the pots and things that they had found. So we've got basically an army that had slings, arrows, and spears that were going to attack this great walled city. And I'm sure that the king of Jericho, he was thinking, well, we're going to be in pretty good shape here because, they don't have the things it's going to take to really attack us. We've got a good water supply. We brought in a bunch of food, and we're going to be in good shape, because he had no idea what was coming. And it's obvious from that. So
I think, we're not getting ahead, but you talk about the king. Commentators said that it wasn't actually a king, he was a military leader.
Right.
And he answered the king in Jerusalem.
Right.
So he was a military leader that Joshua was going up against.
Right.
In a fortified city.
Right.
So
it was a daunting task. Right. Right. Okay, so let's look at verse 1. Now Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. So, here's the comment to kind of set this thing up and kind of emphasize the fact that, number one, the city of Jerusalem was highly fortified. And number two, the leaders there, they knew that the spies had been there, because they've been chasing these spies. They also knew that the spies had escaped. And they knew that the children of Israel could be a very formidable force in battle, because their reputation had preceded them. So these spies had gotten out of there, and it didn't take a genius to figure out that they were going back to where they came from. So the city of Jericho had prepared themselves. They had a water supply. They had brought in food and all the stuff that they were going to need for a siege, because in the mind of their leaders, this was the type of battle that they were going to be fighting. So because they had copious amounts of water, and we know from Joshua 3 and 15 that this attack is going to take place right around the harvest time. So they had plenty of food that they could bring into the city, get the animals in there. So they had a good food supply and they had a good water supply. So those, there are two important things that you're going to need if a city is going to be sieged. Now, the reason that we know this is when they did these archaeological digs, they found these large jars that were full of grain in the homes that were, of course, they were ruins of the homes at the proper level for a battle in about 1400 BC. And this was actually excavated back in the 1930s, and it was by a guy named John Garston. And then it was also excavated again by a lady named Catherine Kenyon. And we'll talk about her a little bit later. She kind of had a minority view of the things that were going on there. So it's recorded here in the first verse of this that the city of Jerusalem, or the city of Jericho, was pretty much ready for the things that were getting ready to happen. All right, let's look at verse 2. And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. So this is the same person who in the preceding chapter was called the captain or prince of the Lord of hosts. And this was probably the same discourse that Bill was talking about last week. And it was interesting, the comments that the scholars made, and also the comments of the ancient writers, back long before Clark and all of them. there was a pretty strong opinion that this was Christ incarnated. And, we talked about that a little bit. We talked about that a little bit last week. That is not a minority opinion. That's kind of a majority opinion by a lot of writers, even going back into ancient time. So this figure, the captain of the Prince of Hosts. This is a continuation of the discourse that was talked about in the preceding chapter. So he is giving Joshua, the good word that he has already given. It's a done deal. It just has to be proceeded with. One of the comments that Caudill and Delitzsch made, and they have a very good commentary on this particular chapter. They were very critical of the way that the chapters were divided in the Bible. They thought that the last part of the 5th chapter should actually be part of the 6th chapter because you're cutting the story in half there. So from Joshua 24 and 11, it seems as if there had been persons of all 7 Canaanite nations in Jericho who might have come together at the time to help Jericho defend against the invading Israelites. So they understood the situation. They knew how powerful the children of Israel could be, and they brought in some reinforcements from some of their allies. And the Tegrim that we've talked about lots of times when we talked about the Old Testament, it indicates that these walls had iron and brass gates and bars, and when these things would be shut up, it would be very difficult to get them to tear them down with battering rams or anything like that. So they had done all of the things necessary, but it was already going to be a done deal. Joshua knew going in that if he did whatever the Lord told him to do, that they were going to take the city. And I'm sure that relieved his mind of how am I going to with slings and arrows take down this big city. Comments about those two verses. All right, now let's look at verses 3 through 5. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go around about the city once. Thou shalt do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when ye hear a sound of trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall flat, and the people shall ascend every man straight before him. So here is the directions, here is the procedure that Joshua is going to use to defeat this city. And in modern terms, what has been laid out here is the tactics and strategy for Joshua to do this. And we see here from a military standpoint, he's got his tactics and strategy, and he has been issued an operational plan of action. And Joshua, being a military man and a very successful military man, he understood about following orders and things along that line. Now, in the Hebrew text, the horns that we're talking about that were referred to as the horns of Jubilee, which was the horns that they used to proclaim the Jubilee. And it is probable that the horns of this animal were used first, but then later on in time, they became metal trumpets. But the text indicates, just as it says, that these were actually ram's horns that were being used, and not the ceremonial brass trumpets that they used, in later time. This was the traditional lance horn.
They used them for signal. They used them practice and in military
Right,
practice.
right. So the design of the whole proceeding of all these things that the children of Israel was doing was obviously designed to impress the Canaanites with the sense of the divine omnipresence that that God had, and to teach the Israelites a memorable lesson of faith and confidence in God's promises, and to inspire the sentiments of respect and reverence for the ark as a symbol of God's presence and power, because the ark of the covenant was, being out front, was going to play a very important role in the operation here, because that was the presence of God. That was the representation of the presence of God. Now, the length of time during which these circuits were made tend to move intensely to arrest the attention and to deepen the impression both on the Israelites and the enemies. They're doing this they're doing this revolution 6 times. It's also, I think, important to note that the number 7 was among the Israelites a symbol of the seal of the covenant between God and the nation. So, they did it 6 times, but on the 7th day, they did it 7th time. And there again, you see the number 7 being used twice, and I'm sure that wasn't lost on the children of Israel. Now, in what order the people themselves marched doesn't exactly appear in the text, but it does give, and we're going to talk about it, it does give a particular order for part of it that needed to be followed. Now, there's some that seem to think that the order in which they marched in the desert was the same order that they marched around the city. So let's look at verses 6 and 7. And it says, "And Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said unto them, Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord. And he said unto the people, Pass on and compass the city, and let him that is armed press on before the ark of the Lord." So here Joshua is giving his captains, his leaders of the different tribes, his leaders of his warriors, he's given their orders of march. So we're going to see it in the beginning. We're going to see a vanguard, and a vanguard is a leading element of some type of attack. And this attack, or this procession, is going to have a vanguard, and this vanguard is going to be the armed warriors. And then they're going to be followed by priests with horns, and then they're going to be followed by the ark of the covenant, and then the people are going to follow. The women, the children, and the young men under the age of 20, the unarmed part of the camp, is distinguished from the armed part of the camp. So you've got the warriors up front, you've got your priests, you've got your ark of the covenant, and then you have the rest of the unarmed people. Now the armed ones were there to guard and protect the ark of the covenant, and also to protect the priests and defend them if there was any move made by the enemy or the people of Jericho upon them. So they had their security already set up, and there seems to be designed that all the males above 20 were able to bear arms, and they were fit for war. And some retain it to the number of about 40,000, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, which came over to help, which was discussed in chapter 1, verse 14. So this is the way that the march is going to go. It's all been laid out for the children, and now it's just kind of a matter of following the orders. Comments up to this point. All right, let's look at verses 8 and 9. "And it came to pass, when Joshua had spoken unto the people, that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns passed on before the Lord, and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went before the priests that blew with the trumpets, and reward came after the ark, the priests going on and blowing with trumpets. Now this reward came before the ark. This is a kind of an interesting word, and it means to collect or to gather up. And it may signify either this reward is the rear army guard or the people who carry the baggage of the army. So, you've got the vanguard out front, you've got the priests with the trumpets, you've got the ark, and then you've got this kind of like a rear guard. Now, there's been some interesting things written about that. One group kind of says, okay, they're kind of carrying the baggage and all the stuff like that. There's another school of thought that this was kind of like the people who were going to, the first aid people, the medics and things along that had extra armament. They were going to take care of anybody that were injured and things along that line. So every detail of this operation is taken care of and obviously thoroughly thought out by God of how He wants this thing to happen. And He really doesn't leave anything to chance. It's all set up there with the warriors and how this procession is going to go.
No matter who the rear guard is, I think it was a significant enough number that
get their attention.
Folks in Jericho were like, "Oh man."
Yeah, they just saw 40,000 up front. Now here's another big group. Yeah. So on the seventh day, it was necessary, as much fighting might naturally be expected in this assault, and they would need a supply of arms, darts, things along that, all the conveniences, water. If something happened to the wounded, they would need to deal with them. So everything was taken care of at that point. Now, if you read this in Jewish history, the Jews seem to think that the division of Dan is talked about being in the last group that's in this procession. And this goes back to Numbers 2:31, where it says, all they that were numbered in the camp of Dan were 100,000 and 57,600, and they shall go hindmost with their standards. So basically, the Jews seem to think that in this great procession, the ones that were bringing up the rear was the tribe of Dan. Whether they did, whether they didn't, it's not really given there. But that's how Jewish tradition, has the situation. Comments about those verses? All right, let's move on to verse 10. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. 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 No stone left unturned. All right, let's look at verse 10. And Joshua had commanded the people, saying, Ye shall not shout, nor make any noise with your voice, neither shall any word proceed out of your mouth until the day I bid you shout, then ye shall shout. So the warriors and the priests were to remain silent as they circled the city each time, except for the last time. And they were commanded to do something on the last time. So God evidently used this strategy to impress the people of Jericho as well as the Israelites that deliverance was not by human might or power. It was going to be by the power of God. And you think about this. You're standing on that wall. This would be a pretty impressive sight. Thousands, and we're talking thousands of people are marching around this city, and the line just goes on and on and on for a long time. Even though it's not very far around the city, it might take them a half hour to march around it. This is going to be a day-long event because you've got so many thousand people, and not a one of them are saying a word.
They can wrap it too, because besides just usually noise you make, you got those trumpets going. And of course, the scripture says they kept going the whole time. They were blowing the trumpets the whole time.
And everybody else is just walking by. I mean, that. Oh, yeah. And they didn't do anything. Well, what are they? What's coming? Yeah, you're right. The anxiety level would be something.
God's siege.
Right, and this would probably been something to see. And little did they know what was going to happen to the wall. Other comments about that verse. All right, let's look at verses 11 through 14. So the ark of the Lord compassed the city, going around it once, and they came into the camp and lodged in the camp. And Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, and 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horn, before the ark of the Lord went continually and blew with the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, and the reward came after the ark of the Lord, the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets. And the second day they encompassed the city once and returned to the camp. So they did 6 days. So, this is just kind of a reinforcement that they were following the directions that they were given, and they were following the directions to the level. Joshua had put his plan into action, and we also note here that Joshua was up early to make sure that everything was in order. And that's kind of a small thing, but that shows you what type of leader that Joshua was. He was leading by example. He was leading from the front, and he was going around to make sure that every detail was being taken care of. And that's the mark of a good leader, who goes around, and the attention to detail is usually the difference between doing something right and not doing something correctly. And that it's a small thing, but it speaks volumes to the type of leader that Joshua was. Comments about those verses? All right, let's look at verses 15 and 16. And it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early. I'm going in the wrong direction here. About the dawn of day, and encompassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they encompassed the city 7 times. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the priest blew the trumpet, Joshua said unto the people, Shout, for the Lord hath given you the city. So on the 7th day, they had to encompass the city 7 times. And, we've got a very large group, and they circled it 7 times. And this is kind of proof that, the circumference of the city was really not that extensive for a group that large in a pretty much a daylight period from the dawn all the way through probably until sunset, to get this group circled around this city 7 times. Shout, the wall will have to collapse, and they have to go in and attack the city. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that had to be done on this one day. So obviously you were going to have sufficient time to get all of this done before dark, because they didn't have night vision glasses and all the stuff that we got now. Pretty much in that day and time, the war was done during the daytime when there was light. So if they hadn't have gotten an early start, it would have been impossible for this to have happened. So it's evident that in the course of these 7 days, there must have been a Sabbath day, if you think about that. And the Sabbath host must have encompassed the city on the other days, and the Jews themselves pretty much allowed this. And there's a lot of very interesting comments from the scholars about this. And basically, he who ordained the observance of the Sabbath commanded it be broken for the destruction of Jerusalem. God gave the instructions for the Sabbath. Since he was the Lord of the Sabbath, if he wanted to postpone one of them, he had that prerogative because he was God that could do that. But it doesn't appear that there could be any breach of the Sabbath day by the people simply by going around the city with the ark in the company. And later we talked about the Sabbath day's journey. Well, that was never thought about in that period of time. So it could have been very easy to have had a Sabbath day in one of the 6 days. And now there are some that contend that the 7th day was the Sabbath day that that this takes place, but there's no record of that in the Scripture to back that up.
Kind of reminds me of see this a lot of times, and it's occurred a lot of times in military history where a late order will come in and they say, well, this trumps all previous orders. And what we're dealing with here is a divine command.
Right.
This whole process is a divine command. And they're going to learn that when they obey the divine command, good things are going to happen.
Right.
That's
right. And that's one of the things that kind of goes back to this deal about the Christ incarnated because of that right there. Well, I tell you what, this is a good place to stop. We'll tear the wall down next week, and because there's a lot of interesting stuff that we haven't talked about yet. So I appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.